In Lesson 6.02, Debate and Division of your U.S. History course, Part A, you'll be learning about the final situations in U.S. history that caused the United States to go into civil war. And a lot of this has to do with Supreme Court case decisions like the Dred Scott decision, and also political polarization or a changing and alignment of political parties from Whig and Democrat to Whig and Republican. The political situation in the United States would change based on largely on people's view on slavery, whether they wanted free territories in certain areas or slave. And it became the new norm that determined what political party that you were part of. So the country was becoming increasingly divided. The goals for the lesson are to explain political realignments that resulted in the rise of the Republican Party in the 1850s, also to recognize the impact of the Dred Scott decision and identify John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. For this lesson, you're going to be reading pages 402 to 406. There is a reading guide, so before you go into your textbook, make sure that you download your reading guide from slide 3, print it off, and be ready to find those answers in the textbook as you read these pages. Remember that the reading guide is very important for you to identify key information and to perform well on checkpoints, quizzes, and tests. Trying to get through the course successfully without taking adequate notes and determining where your understanding breaks down or where the areas are that you do understand will not allow you to prepare adequately for a quiz or for a test. So let's take a look at your reading for this lesson. Beginning on page 402, we see that the situation in the United States at this time, right before the Civil War, after the legislation that became known as Bleeding Kansas, where popular sovereignty was determining whether or not a territory was free or slave in the Kansas Territory, the United States was basically being ripped apart by a series of events. These crisis level events continued as people became more heated about their position in politics and what side of the slavery issue that they fell on. And you would find in 1856 that even on the Senate floor, senators would come to blows over the issue itself. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a long, dramatic speech about the crime against Kansas. He was a fierce opponent of slavery and then was subsequently, or as a result, attacked by a pro-slavery senator on the floor who disagreed with him and also felt that he was basically treating the name of a fellow congressman badly. Okay, Preston Brooks, a relative of Butler, who Sumner was speaking out against, was moved to violence, and there was actually violence on the floor of the Senate. So things were quickly unraveling, and we see that the birth of the Republican Party also forms here. Now we have to be very careful because the Republican Party that they're talking about in the book at this time is not the same as the Republican Party that we see today. This Republican Party and the Democratic Party during the day separated largely based on the slave issue. So people, instead of having varying degrees of political views on several subjects, really were starting to polarize based on the slave issue almost almost exclusively. The Dred Scott case is a court case that reaches the Supreme Court that had to do with whether or not slaves could be brought into a new territory with their master if it was a free territory. And the Supreme Court case this case actually did go all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the Dred Scott case said more than just that a slave could be brought into a free territory and still not regain their freedom. It stated in no uncertain terms that slaves were property and had absolutely no governmental rights. They had no civil rights under the Constitution. and that was a decision made by the Supreme Court. Now, the thing that really becomes the flashpoint before the South secedes from the Union is the rise of Abraham Lincoln into presidential politics. But Abraham Lincoln was not just automatically a successful politician. He really had to do a lot of work and suffered a lot of political defeats before he could move into the presidency. In fact, he was largely a small town lawyer for quite some time, and then moved himself into state politics and found himself running against a man named Stephen Douglas. And as they were running for political office against each other, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln held a series of very famous and very foretelling public policy debates. They held a series of political debates against each other in which Lincoln became very, very popular with the people and really pushed him into the national limelight, pushed him into the national scene of politics. So, as Lincoln is becoming ever more widely known on a national political scale, so is a man named John Brown. John Brown was present in Bleeding, Kansas, as they were trying to determine whether the territory was free or slave based on popular sovereignty or the vote of the people. There was a lot of violence against people back and forth, against the slave and anti-slave factions, or the free soilers as they would become known. Brown was an extremist and really believed that the abolition of slavery had to come to pass, and he did not shy away. Even though he was claimed to be a religious man, he did not shy away from violence to do so. So one of his ideas was to go to Harper's Ferry in what is now West Virginia and try to claim the munitions, the military munitions there, and seize some of the ammunition and weapons from Harper's Ferry to try to incite a slave rebellion in the South. Things went horribly wrong, and Brown is captured and then is eventually executed for his crimes. So he is hung, and this is one of the big things that does increase tensions and lead to civil war. The straw that breaks the camel's back, however, is the election of 1860 that you read on your last page of your reading for this lesson. The election of 1860, in which Lincoln is elected to the presidency, is what ultimately causes South Carolina to secede from the Union. They simply cannot stomach the idea of having a Republican president. They believe that his policies are going to be too repressive for them, even though Lincoln had run on the policy of trying to reach across to the South and heal the wounds before war basically came to be. The South did not trust this and did decide to secede. South Carolina was the first. Slowly, some other, actually, a couple of states would quickly follow, but then slowly several other states would join, and you will be reading about that in this first section. Now, remember, don't go too far into the election of 1860. Really, your reading for this lesson is basically ending with John Brown, but it is good to know that the election of 1860 is coming up in your reading, because that is the final part in the growing disunion that we are generally speaking of here. While you move through your lesson, you're going to notice that you also have an online activity. When you click on this online activity, it will bring up a new window, and these activities are going to ask you to fill in the blank. Okay, so for example, if I were going to finish the first slide, I would fill in the information there and click next to the next slide. So there are a series of review questions with fill in the blank that you must answer. Once you finish this, it's going to give you a word, and that word is what you are going to use to complete your 6.02 checkpoint. If you click on the checkpoint here and enter into it, you'll notice that the checkpoint gives you a blank in which you need to put that word. Once you've completed the checkpoint, you will be done with your work on lesson 6.02. Please contact me with any questions.